It is just after the top of the hour, so we are going to go ahead and get started. My name is Kimberly Tsoukalis with the Lister Hill Center for Health Policy located here at UAB, and I'm very excited to welcome everyone to today's webinar with Dr. Saikawa on climate smart agriculture. And now it is my absolute pleasure to introduce our speaker for today. Dr. Eri Saikawa is an associate professor of environmental sciences at Emory University, where she conducts interdisciplinary research on the environment. She's worked on diverse projects that cover atmospheric chemistry, environmental health, biogeochemistry, climate science, and environmental policy. And her work was recently cited in the IPCC report at the United Nations. So with all of that being said, Eri, I will take it off to you.
So yes, you are here for the Climate Smart Agriculture talk. But I wanted to start off talking about air pollution a little bit and then move on to climate change and agriculture. And I wanted to combine with a little bit of the heavy metal soil contamination work that we've been doing. So I really started off working on air pollution, and this image really made me interested in working on air pollution. So this is the picture that was taken by a photographer that decided to take the picture from the same place at the same time every single day for 365 days in 2014. I think he decided in 2013, and this is in Beijing, and it really illustrates well the blue sky days compared to the gray sky days. And you are all in public health, I believe, and so we all know the health impacts of being exposed to this air pollution. What I was really intrigued by is this is a lung tissue when you are exposed to the clean air. This is supposedly the normal lung tissue, and then it can really get inflamed. But what really made me interested in air pollution is also the impacts on agriculture. So the most recent paper by Fun et al., I think that's a very good illustration of how air pollution can impact the agricultural yields. So these are the 4 different crops. These are both at the top is the rice, and this is the inbred, and this is the hybrid, and this is wheat, and this part is maize or corn. So you can see because of the exposure to ozone, you can get 40% yield reduction because of that. And I think we're going to be talking about climate change, but in combination to air pollution, what is it going to happen if we are also having population increase? And there is now an estimate that under climate change, we're going to have the nutrition change. So there's a lot of complex issues with air pollution and climate change on agriculture. So I've been saying air pollution quite a bit. I mentioned ozone. What I really mean by air pollution in this talk is really the tropospheric ozone. We would talk a little bit about the stratospheric ozone as well, but the particulate matter in addition to that. So ozone, as you might all know, is not emitted directly, but it is made under the chemical reaction under sunlight. So this is mainly the chemical reaction between nitrogen oxides and volatile organic compounds. And what's close to us is the bad ozone. It's an oxidant, but the good ozone is in the stratosphere that prevents the UV radiation, ultraviolet radiation, from coming to the surface. The particulate matter, those are very small particles, and we are mainly interested in PM2.5 and PM10, but these can be directly emitted, but they can also be formed in the atmosphere as well. And so that can be primary emissions or the secondary aerosols. They can both be inorganic or organic. So when I started off in my PhD, I was really just a modeler. And what I mean by that is really looking at these inputs and working on chemical transport models. So this was one of the data sets that I was working on during my PhD, and this is showing the gridded PM2.5 emissions data set. When we look at it like this, it seems like the emissions are pretty well determined. But when you go into China, for example, I'm showing you 3 different emissions inventories. This is the global emission inventory that I was showcasing, that's called EDGAR. This is the regional emission inventory, and this is the national emission inventory. You can probably see that the PM10 emissions estimates vary quite substantially over different emissions inventories you use. That's the same for carbon monoxide, and this is the non-methane volatile organic compound. What is very interesting is that what we put into the model obviously results in different outputs. And so, we were having a lot more PM10 as the emissions inputs. And so we are seeing more concentrations as a result. But you might realize that even though we have more emissions for VOCs, for example, and for NOx as well, we are actually seeing less ozone in this inventory. And that's because this is the nonlinear chemical process. And that makes it all the more important that we have a better understanding of the emissions. So then that really got me interested in where these emissions are coming from. And what I used to do was to really look at these different emissions inventories and the source sectors that these emissions inventories are estimated to come from, and then figure out where the uncertainties might be. And so one of the studies that we did initially was looking at this residential sector. We realized that this is quite important, and that was mainly because of these 3 billion people using solid fuels for cooking and heating that we might be very aware of. I'm not going to go into that, but there's a lot of health impacts for it. And then that made us interested in thinking about different emission sources that we don't necessarily have in the emissions inventory. And one of the sources was garbage burning. And so we tried to understand how much might be coming from these garbage burning. And we estimated that there can be quite a significant increase by adding the potential garbage burning emissions into the model. And that led to the PM2.5 increase that you're seeing in this model results. And I think for the health component, we estimated that this increase in PM2.5 could potentially lead to 300,000 premature mortality increase just from the source sector. And we are just looking at PM2.5, and you would think that there are so many other toxic chemical substances that are coming out of the garbage burning. So what would be the total health impact is something that we are very interested in as well. But that made us think about the link between climate change and air pollution. So obviously from garbage burning, there is CO2 coming out as well. And you might have realized that when I showed you the emissions estimates, agriculture was nowhere. So agriculture is usually considered as a very different source sector in the model. And I found that very fascinating how it really leads, leads to air pollution and also climate change. And that comes back to agriculture as well. So what I mean by that is methane that I've mentioned a little bit is a very big component of climate change. I'm going to go into that next. But that comes a lot from agriculture. And ammonia, this is a very important the precursor for PM2.5. So it results in secondary aerosol formation, as you see here. And so methane and ammonia are all emitted from agriculture quite substantially. In addition to that, there is carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide coming from agriculture too. And that also goes back as ozone exposure to agriculture. And then both ozone and PM, I've mentioned, is obviously impacting health. And so there is so much complexity. And I feel that we are not talking about this enough in the context of climate and human health. And I just wanted to bring this paper, Bauer et al., I believe did a very good job explaining how important agriculture is in terms of PM2.5 concentrations. So you can see here, agriculture is shown on the right-hand side. So for the Western US, it is much smaller compared to this natural source contribution. It is about the same contribution as for the anthropogenic source. But for Eastern US and for Europe and for Eastern China, it is about the same comparing to both anthropogenic and natural source. Obviously, that is not the case for India. And so let's think about climate change for agriculture as well. So we know that carbon dioxide is a very most important greenhouse gas, and that's listed at the top. This one is the figure that's showing the radiative forcing, which is the difference in energy coming into the earth and going out to back to the space. And so obviously, if it's positive, then it's warming the atmosphere. And if it's negative, it's cooling. So the second largest greenhouse gas is methane. And the third largest greenhouse gas is nitrous oxide, N2O. And we want to make sure that this is different from NOx that we've been talking about as air pollutants. So NOx is a short-lived air pollutant, and N2O, nitrous oxide, is a greenhouse gas. And this is very important because N2O is completely inert in the troposphere, but because of its very long lifetime of more than 100 years, it can go to the stratosphere and actually create, destroy stratospheric ozone. So it's one of the major destructing substance for stratospheric ozone right now because N2O is not regulated by the Montreal Protocol. I'm going to go into that in a little bit more detail, but I just wanted you to remember N2O is different from NOx, and it's very important for climate change. You would see halocarbons is lumped together as the third. And you will find ozone here in different places. So in this case, ozone, what it means is that if we have more halocarbons, then we will be destroying stratospheric ozone. And so because of that, we are seeing the cooling impact. So the stratospheric ozone is positive. It's a greenhouse gas, but in this case, it is negative because it is considering the increasing halocarbons. And then aerosols are also very important for climate change. So aerosols themselves could be warming or cooling, depending on the chemical species. So this is the very important research that's been going on in atmospheric chemistry. What kind of chemical compositions are they and how does it impact the climate? And I think that's a very important link to human health as well. And aerosols are important for cloud formation too. And this is the biggest uncertainty that we have in the climate model. It is very difficult to model cloud formation. And that's why this is the only low confidence among the species that you're seeing here. So this is just showing briefly the sources of greenhouse gases. And you can see that agriculture shares a pretty fair amount for greenhouse gas. And I think that we don't talk necessarily too much about it. And I'm just saying here that I think we should. And as a policy side, I think there has been a lot of talk on carbon sequestration and how that could be a potential solution for climate change. So one of the initiatives is 4 per mil initiative that I'm showing here. And I think this is extremely important to enhance carbon sequestration potential. But I do fear that we only talk about carbon and nitrogen is sometimes forgotten. And carbon and nitrogen is very well linked in the terrestrial system. And so it seems to be the missing piece that I see just focusing on carbon sequestration. Going back to CO2, I'm sure many of you have seen this figure. We are seeing a very steep increase in atmospheric mixing ratio of carbon dioxide. This is taken at Mauna Loa Observatory in Hawaii. And I think this NASA figure shows very well about how the current rate is so much faster than what we have seen in the previous centuries. And so this is coming from the new IPCC 6th assessment report. So this was very much highlighted. This is the degrees Celsius over time. And so we are seeing the unprecedented warming in more than 2,000 years. And the estimate is that it is more than 1.1 degrees Celsius warmer compared to the pre-industrial times. So the major summary of this 6th assessment report that just came out last year is that the CO2 mixing ratio is the highest in at least 2 million years. the sea level rise is the fastest rate in at least 3,000 years. And the Arctic area, Arctic sea ice area is at the lowest level in at least 1,000 years. And the glaciers retreat is also very unprecedented. So things look very grim. I think in terms of thinking about impact, this is also coming from the AR6. The extreme heat is going to be more frequent. So in terms of the health impacts, this is going to be very important, considering that heat is the biggest cause of death in terms of natural disasters. And heavy rainfall is going to be also more frequent. It's going to be, the wet places are going to be wetter, and the dry places are going to be drier. And that's going to lead to more wildfires that we're going to see, and that is also going to have a lot of air quality impacts, health impacts from that. And at the end, there is going to be also ocean acidification and warming, and that's going to lead to the sea level rise as well. So the major summary from this AR6 is that the observed warming is driven by emissions, by human activities, and I think it's very important that they focus on greenhouse gases and also aerosols. So the emissions are very important, and I'm glad that they have this figure. So what they did is, this is the observed warming. We are seeing 1.1 degree increase, and we can separate out looking at what is the source of this increase. So total human influence is 1.1 degrees, and then they estimate that coming from greenhouse gases only, it would have been 1.5 degree increase. But because of the cooling impacts of aerosols, we are seeing some of the reduction in that temperature increase, and that's leading to 1.1 degrees. So I hope that it made sense that I started off with air pollution before coming into climate change. And comparing to natural factors and internal variability, they are so not having any impact into what we are seeing as a whole compared to the pre-industrial times. So methane is extremely important, as I mentioned, for agriculture as well and for climate change. And the trend is very different from for carbon dioxide, and I think that is very important to think about. So it was very stable during the 2000s, and we are seeing the increase in the recent years. So this is a very hot debate, why this is happening again, why is it increasing? Is that the natural gas related, fracking related, or is it because of wildfires? And this data is coming from different places all over the world where the stations exist. For nitrous oxide, the trend is very similar to carbon dioxide, and it's a very linear increase. And this is very concerning, considering that this is impacting stratospheric ozone depletion as well as impacting climate change. So what I did for that was a part that was cited in the IPCC report was to figure out where these N2O emissions were coming from. To do that, we could use the model. And then first we tried to create where the emissions might be coming from. So that's the first guess, that's the prior emissions. And then we would run the model as is. There is always a model uncertainty, but then we would get the predicted mixing ratio everywhere in the world in the global model. What we can do is we can perturb per the sector that you are interested in and per region that you are interested in, one at a time, and then run the model. And so you would get different mixing ratio, and you would have many numbers of simulation runs. And then you can compare all those simulations to the basic run that you did. And then that will lead to finding out how that specific source in that specific region affects the mixing ratio in different areas. And using that information of the prior emissions with the uncertainty and then the atmospheric observational data, taking into account the observational uncertainty, you can improve the emissions estimates and create optimized emissions. So this is what we did. And this is the results. So the sectors that we were interested in is 5 different sectors: agricultural soil, natural soil, industry, biomass burning, and ocean. And these are the regions. You can also see them over here as well. We created different regions in the ocean too. But they are pretty coarse regions because we don't have as much observational data as we would like. There's no satellite data available for N2O. It is extremely difficult to measure, and that's why we can only do these coarse regions in the Beijing framework. What you can see is that in different regions, you are seeing the trend over time. But what was very interesting to me was that the only region and the sector that we were seeing the statistically significantly increasing trend is from the Southern Asia and agricultural soil. So Southern Asia is this region that includes China and India. And that region's agricultural soil emissions over time was the only region that was increasing for N2O. And so then that led us to think that this is mainly because of the nitrogen fertilizer application. We know that the nitrogen fertilizer application has been increasing very rapidly in the world, but this has really been mainly from the global south. So this purple is China. So the global north, the fertilizer use has been plateauing since 1990s. And so the US used to be the first, but then it has become the third over time. And India has taken over the second place. And what's interesting is the fourth place is Pakistan. So that is also in the Southern Asia region that I mentioned. So then we were curious which crop uses the most amount of fertilizer. And what we found out was that maize, corn was that uses fertilizer, the nitrogen fertilizer the most. So our very simple question was, if the reason might be that we are applying fertilizer, is it possible that we would be able to reduce the fertilizer use and that would lead to less N2O emissions? And so we thought about climate smart agriculture. So this is the definition of climate smart agriculture. So the first one is to increase productivity. That is very important. The second is to be able to adapt and build resilience to climate change. And the third lists the reducing of greenhouse gas emissions. So we started doing this field work in Watkinsville, Georgia, which is east of Atlanta, where I am. It's about an hour and a half away. This is the experimental station at the University of Georgia. So this is the plot from the top, and we had the field that we were working on. And instead of using the synthetic fertilizer, we wanted to see if we could use this system as natural fertilizer, which is using the nitrogen fixer. It's a perennial crop. This is a white clover that can provide nitrogen to the soil. And so we would grow white clover throughout the winter, and then we would create a strip when it's time to grow corn. And then as corn grows, it starts to die. But it doesn't die completely even at the end of the growing season. And so it would still be able to come back without the reseeding process because it is perennial. So we wanted to understand, can we reduce both ammonia and greenhouse gas emissions by using this natural system? So we did the 4 different agricultural practices comparison. The first one here is the no cover crop. So it's just the bare soil applying fertilizer. And this is the living mulch system that I just mentioned. And this is the cereal rye cover crop. So the cereal rye is the most widely used cover crop in Georgia. And this provides carbon to the soil, but it does not provide nitrogen. Crimson clover is an annual nitrogen fixer, and so it can provide nitrogen to the soil and carbon as well, but it is an annual cover crop. So it dies after a year and doesn't come back. So then we wanted to compare how are the greenhouse gases in these agricultural practices. So we had 3 chambers per plot, and we had replicates, 3 replicates of the 4 techniques that I just mentioned, and they were laid out like that. And we used what's called Picaro. This is the instrument that I'm showing here, and we had the automated manifold here that's on top of each other. And we would have the manual capping chamber like this. So we would cap the cutter, the chamber, for a certain amount of time to see the accumulation. And from that accumulation of gases, we can calculate the fluxes coming out of the soil. So we had different plots that we measure and then go around this manifold would change the chambers that we measure automatically. We also created this low-cost sensor type measurement instrument that's called acid trap to figure out ammonia concentrations. Picaro can also measure ammonia too, but it would be very nice if we can measure in much more least cost manner. So this is what one of my scientists in the lab created, and we would put sulfuric acid in here and then bubble the air into it to capture it, and then we would analyze in the lab. So this is the results, and I hope that qualitatively it's pretty clear that the soil is very different for the living mulch compared to the others. So you can see the numbers. So first, the nitrogen fertilizer addition is the highest for the no cover crop and the cereal rye because they do not have any nitrogen applied to the soil. The crimson clover plot has a little bit more compared to the living mulch. We are still giving 50 kilograms per hectare of nitrogen fertilizer to the soil. This is the bulk density. So that's the soil compaction. And I think it is pretty qualitatively clear that these are so much more, pressed compared to this. And then I think the porosity is similar, how much space is there, pore space is there in the soil. You have so much more pore space that you see in this living mulch. KSAT is the soil infiltration rate after the ground is completely saturated. So how much water can you uptake? And that's very important. This water held capacity is just depending on the soil type, usually just the physical capacity that's based on the soil type. So you don't see much difference. But the labile carbon, you're seeing that there's so much more carbon now in the living mulch system. So from the soil health perspective, this looks very good. But when we actually look at soil carbon dioxide that is emitted, we also see much more CO2 coming out of the living mulch system. And that is not very surprising. If you have more carbon, you can have more CO2. But also, we want to make sure that it's going to be sequestered. And so I feel that we need to think about how can we actually retain the sequestered carbon into the soil. That needs to be discussed more. And in terms of nitrous oxide, we do also see the living mulch sometimes increasing quite high amount when especially the clover is dying and giving more nitrogen. This is methane, and it's quite interesting for us that soil is serving as a sink. So I feel this is also something that we need to be thinking about. How can we enhance the sequestration potential for methane as well, and not just for carbon dioxide? But for ammonia, this was not very, this did not look what we had hoped. And so we were seeing much higher ammonia emissions coming out from the living mulch plot compared to the traditional plot. And that was almost always the case for any day that we measured. And what was very interesting for us is that when we compared the ammonia emissions from 3 different places in the world, it was very different. So China is on the left-hand side with this left-hand side axis. And Rwanda and the US, it goes with the right-hand axis. You can see that there is 2 orders of magnitude difference, We know that there have been much more application of fertilizer in China in general, but we also believe that we need to look into the pH and other reasons for why that might be. But we do have much higher ammonia concentrations usually in China too. And I think this is extremely important to understand and how that might be leading to PM concentrations. And so we try to take into account all the greenhouse gas fluxes, carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and methane, the soil carbon, because soil carbon was increased in living mulch. We want to make sure that we take that out, we take that as a positive. And then irrigation, fertilizer, and herbicide application also result in greenhouse gas emissions. And so taking all that into account to calculate how much net carbon are we seeing from each of the agricultural techniques led to these differences among the practices. So crimson clover, cereal rye, and traditional seem to have around a similar range from 40 to 100 kilograms per hectare per year. And that was quite different for the living mulch. That was a little bit higher from 60 to 140. But then we also realized that there were some white clover in the chamber that we measured. And so we were unfortunately not able to take the clover amount, but we were able to estimate using the previous results. And if we were to take into account, then potentially there could be much less net carbon equivalence. But what we are trying to do now is to really understand how much might be coming from the soil and what is the holistic picture in terms of the climate impact coming from the agricultural practices from maize. And we also want to understand the ammonia as well. And so there are more questions than I can answer at this point, but that led us to heavy metal soil contamination. And the reason why is agriculture is clearly related to food desert in the US especially. And you can see that Southeast has a lot of areas where there's no car and no supermarket within a mile. So people rely on gas stations and other junk food coming from those places, not the vegetables, not the fresh produce. And what's happening that we saw is a lot of community gardens blossoming to create more fresh produce, which I think is a great thing. But I think we don't really know enough about greenhouse gases coming from these areas as well. And I think I'm very curious about the grass as well in residential areas, because we put a lot of fertilizer too. What might be the impact coming from those grass in our residential areas on climate change and also air pollution too. But anyway, going back to community gardens, and I think this was the case for COVID as well. Because of COVID, many people started to produce their own food. And I think sometimes we forget about the soil contaminants. And I just realized by talking with some of the students in environmental health that there is actually no regulation to test for heavy metals or these contaminants before you grow food. And we know that health impacts of lead exposure could be very detrimental to children especially. And what I've been learning is that it's not very easy to tell if the kids are exposed to lead, because there's so many different health impacts that is not unique to lead poisoning. And then the biggest impact of obviously we see is from lead is this impact on children's development. So when they're exposed to lead, then they can that can have impacts on signaling in the brain, and that would affect their IQ and also their ability at school. And this figure really reminds me of the climate change, how it would change under climate change with the temperature. We know that as climate change happens, there is going to be the temperature is going to shift. And this one is shifting to the left. And then for the temperature, it's going to be shifting to the right with more extreme heat. But this is telling us that if the kids are exposed to lead, then they're going to have more intellectual disability and then less gifted children. And I think we really have to think about who are these kids that are going to be impacted. And not everybody is impacted in the same way, but these are going to be the vulnerable populations that are going to be more prone to this exposure to lead. And what I found very interesting is the link between the soil lead and the blood lead levels. So this is from Milky et al. And he compared the soil lead and the median blood lead levels in New Orleans in 2 different time periods. And you can see in both time periods, even though both soil lead and the median blood lead have gone down significantly, there is still pretty good relationship between the two. And so when the city of Atlanta started this Aguanta program to enhance urban agriculture, I asked the agriculture director if they were testing for lead. And they said, no, they're not testing. And so we got the permission to test for the lead in this areas where they were going to create urban agriculture in Atlanta. And one of the areas, sorry, this is very blurry, but in Atlanta, in the west side, where there is mainly low income and primarily African-American neighborhoods, we found that the lead level that the Aguanta was trying to take place had very high lead levels. And so then we were able to partner with a community partner, Historic Westside Gardens, community organization, Historic Westside Gardens, and we were able to measure 11 residential lots in the west side and 5 agricultural lots in the west side and compare them to 3 different backgrounds. So the orange is what's considered as a state gardening screening level, and the red is the EPA screening level, 400 ppm. And we found 3 of the 11 lots to be higher than 400 ppm. And we were stunned that most of the sites were not meeting the state gardening screening level. And the reason was because of this slag dumping that was happening in the neighborhood. And so the community partner came to us one day and said, if this slag pieces might be the reason why they're seeing high lead levels in their soil. And that was exactly why. So the slag themselves, when we measured in the lab, after crushing them and sieving them, they were about 1200 ppm in the mean. And the soil beneath it was also about the same lead levels. And so that made the site be investigated by the EPA, and it became a Superfund site. And now it was recommended last year to be listed as on the national priorities list. And so it really started with where we were working with the Historic Westside Gardens on the Vine City with the 60 lots. And then it increased to 360 lots. It then increased to 1087 lots. And now it is 2087 lots, I believe. And so it just keeps expanding, and it is very disheartening to see how these people of color are being impacted. And then so many people tell me about how they feel that their kids are impacted because of lead exposure. So we use both X-ray fluorescence XRF and the ICP-MS inductively coupled plasma with mass spectrometry to figure out the different levels of heavy metals and metalloids in these soil samples. And we found out that the lead, the correlation is pretty good between the 2 instruments. So we are able to use the XRF, which is much cheaper, as a screening device. But that was not necessarily the case for the other ones. But we were finding other elements also higher than the gardening screening level. So these ones that are shown as yellow, we are finding higher levels than what is the UGA screening level. And in our samples, all of the lead levels were higher than 400 ppm. And then the zinc, all of them were higher than the state gardening screening level. So this is showing at the background is showing the population, median household income level. So in the greater Atlanta area. So this southwest is having very low median household income compared to other places. The bubbles that you're seeing inside, the size of the bubble is the proportion of children that are tested for lead. And only about 20% of the children are screened for lead, which I think is not acceptable. And the color of the bubble is showing the proportion of kids that have blood lead levels higher than 5 micrograms per deciliter. The CDC changed the reference values to 3.5, but when we did this study, that was not the case. And so we still use the 5 micrograms per deciliter. And in this area, this is the area that we were investigating with the historic Westside Gardens, but the zip code right next to that actually has 13% of kids that have high blood lead levels. Why am I talking about all of this? I hope that it was clear that air pollution, climate change, and health are extremely linked in a way that I didn't really think about when I started this work. And agriculture is extremely important for mitigating both the soil greenhouse gases and air pollutant emissions. But how can we do that simultaneously is not easy at all. And considering that garbage burning could potentially cause nearly 300,000 premature deaths from COPD only in India and Nepal. If we think about it, everything in the air can be deposited in the soil. And so there is so much link to air and soil. And I think we are not taking that into account enough, how much health impacts that might be from breathing that toxic air, but how much might be going into the soil that we are growing food with. And what is the climate change impact, and how would climate change impact agriculture because of that? So urban agriculture is blossoming, and that's great, but what is the impact on climate because of the fertilizer use that we are seeing, and also potentially pesticide in some areas? And we are seeing these heavy metals in the soils, and we have been very sad to see that not many people are aware of these issues. And I think we need to have more people test the soil and also to test their kids for blood lead levels. So my take-home message is to we need to think more holistically. And this is all related to policy. I think the biggest challenge we have that I see is that it is very easy to think about a policy solution, thinking only about one problem. Like if we're thinking about climate change, we can say, okay, carbon sequestration is an issue, so let's increase it. But what happens if we are also increasing N2O emissions by increasing carbon sequestration? What would be the really ideal policy if we're thinking about all these holistic issues together? I think that's why we need to have different experts on the table together to think about these issues that are really connected, but not necessarily studied well together. So I would like to acknowledge my lab members. This is all because of the people behind the scenes. So you are seeing Rosario Hernandez here. She's the director of Historic Westside Gardens. And I couldn't talk about her work, but Xinyi actually did a lot of work on phytoremediation. It's so interesting how much can be taken up by plants, and that was coming from the needs of the community members. And St. Peter's did a lot of work on greenhouse gas emissions that I mentioned. And all of these other folks that I'm showing are the ones that really led this soil work. And this is the most recent picture with masks. It is really a great picture with me being halved. I was laughing so much about it, but we were very happy that we're able to come back together now. And I have so many collaborators that I need to thank. I don't have time for it, but I also would like to thank the funding sources and I also wanted to, if I could, just let you know, I run Emory Climate Talks that you see on my background, and we have the conversations with different folks every month now. And Ramon Cruz is going to be joining us this coming Friday. So if you are interested, please come join us. We've had people like the Prime Minister of Barbados as well in the past. So that's also on the YouTube channel if you go there. You can find that information on this website too. We have the Amplifier podcast episodes if you are podcast listeners. And I will open up for questions. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation. I think that we all have really learned a lot. If you do have any questions, we've had a few come in through the Q&A box, but go ahead and get those typed out. And I'm going to get us started just to bring things back to a policy perspective. When we're talking about that heavy metal toxicity in urban gardening, from a policy perspective, do you think it's more important to focus on mitigation or prevention?
I definitely think prevention. There is so much we can be doing to prevent, and that's why I think we need to be pushing for testing so that we don't put the kids into unnecessary exposure. And I think we should be doing so much better job than that. I mean, after the fact, it's too late. So these lead exposure, as I understand, is, once you are exposed, you are exposed. And I think we really need to do a much better job to prevent that situation.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to get started in answering some of these questions from the Q&A box. And Evelyn had just something that was a little bit different. And she was talking about the slag dumping in neighborhoods is what causes those high levels of lead. Are there any local or federal bills to prevent the dumping of slag in residential areas? Are there any in progress, and how can we support them?
Yeah, this is a very good question. So the problem with the slag dumping is that it happened long time ago, before there was the CERCLA bill to prevent this kind of dumping. And so we believe that this might have happened in the 60s or so. And so at that time, they were considered to be a very non-toxic material, and that's why they use that as the fill material and also the fundamentals of the building. So what we are seeing is that the EPA is now cleaning up, and they told me that they sometimes dug 8 feet and they were still seeing slag. And so they decided that they cannot go on because they are saying, in so many places, it's just deep dumped so much. And so they're only digging up to a foot or two now. So I think this is a very big problem, but I don't think it's just, in Atlanta. I think it is pretty prevalent in many different places too. So how can we figure that out? And the history of it is, I think, very important, but it's been so difficult to find. So I just wonder if that's because of the low income neighborhood. We don't have enough history, like historical document potentially, or was that area chosen because of that? We cannot tell from the existing documents that we could find.
That kind of leads into one of the next questions, which is, how can you test lead levels in your backyard before planting a garden? And if you find the high lead levels, what do you do next? How can you decrease those?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. So in Georgia, what we started doing is called Community Science Soil Shop. So we have the collection boxes in different parts of Atlanta, greater Atlanta area. And then we also allow people to send in the soil samples. We have a video that shows how to collect soil samples, and then they need to dry them, and then they can either ship them or drop them off. And then we would analyze them for free and then give them the results. So these are just screening. So it's not the full testing because we're not sieving them or anything like that. But I think that's a good way to know if that might be contaminated, to look into it more. But the latter question is more important, like what can you do once you know that it is contaminated? So I think this is also a problem why people are not really willing to test. Because if you find that there is lead in your soil, then you have to disclose if you want to sell the house. And so there have been a lot of people, that not a lot, but there have been several people that tell me that they found slag in their backyard. And when I asked them if I could, if we could go and take soil samples to figure out the lead levels, they would say no, because they want to make sure that their home value is not going to be impacted. So that's a problem. Another thing, though, that what you can do is you can definitely clean up. The cleaning up can be very expensive. And so if you dig, that's the best way, but it would cost a lot of money. And so the reason why the community partners were asking is if we can use the hyperaccumulator plants as a way to take up. So when we did the testing with sunflowers, with cowpeas, Chinese cabbage, and globe amaranth, we saw quite good results from Chinese cabbage and cowpeas, but it also went to the edible parts. So we were doing that in the greenhouse, but then we are very worried about actually doing that experiment in the field in case that kids come and then start eating them, because that would be another exposure route. So there is no very good way, I think, in a cost-effective manner, and that is a problem. But you can do easy things like washing hands, for example, and then making sure that dogs, if you have dogs or cats, the pets, they wouldn't be going into the, the garden and then coming back with their dirty feet everywhere in the home, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the questions was, what was the crop productivity comparison across the 4 groups? I think this was in reference to the experiment with rye and clover.
Yeah, that's a very good point. So it really depends if it's a drought year or not. So if there's a lot of rain, then living mulch does a very good job. It does need a lot of water though. So in the drought year, the yield was very different, substantially low for the living mulch. And so that is a big problem. I think that we need to figure out. We were hoping that the fertilizer and also the pesticide, herbicide can be expensive. And if that's the case, you can have much less of those. And so even though the yield is lower, it would still be economically profitable. But I think that really depends on the price of those herbicide, pesticide, and irrigation as well.
And there's actually another question about pesticides. So I'm glad that you brought that up. They said that you talked a lot about the fertilizer and its impact on the environment. Do pesticides have that same negative impact? And then how does organic farming differ as far as the environmental impact there?
Yeah, I'm so glad somebody asked this. So the current field work that we've been doing since last summer, and then we will be doing again this summer, is actually looking at that exact impact. If we were to have a lot of pesticides or insecticides, are we going to kill the microbes? And then is that going to lead to less emissions? We are not seeing that so far, and it is quite interesting. But we are going to continue that again and see what might be the impact. And so the organic farming, I would love to compare, if you had different history, how would that compare? So far, we haven't been able to do that, but I think that is a very important question, that we would like to look into.
Well, it sounds like we have to bring you back next year is what I'm hearing, so we can hear the results of that study. It looks like we've got one more question, and then if anybody has any others, go ahead and get those in so we can answer those in the last 5 minutes. When it comes to climate change policy, there's a lot of finger pointing between industry and individual action. So in your experience working with agriculture, which is more important, and what individual actions can we take that are going to make the biggest amount of difference?
Yeah, I get asked that question a lot, and I do think that we need to be pointing at the industry, because 90% of the emissions are potentially coming from 100 very small number of industries. And then if they are not going to do anything, then nothing is going to happen. I don't want to say that the individual actions are not important, but I do think that the industry, the companies that are really burning a lot of fossil fuel need to stop. And otherwise, even if we do everything we can, that's not going to stop climate change. But that being said, I think the individual efforts to really voice the concerns, to push the government and also the industry, I think is important. And we see that a lot from the youth movement. I think they are the hope, and they have shown how that's possible and how that could work. So I think we need to do that more than I think I would like to, I wouldn't say, eating meat is eating meat is not good, but then I don't think that kind of action could potentially make the most impactful difference.
Yes, we've got 2 more questions left, and hopefully we can get to both of them. Alyssa asked, having done work around ammonia emissions in the past, I was wondering what level of uncertainty you saw in your measurements. Were there any other sources near the test plots in Watkinsville?
That is such a good question. So ammonia emissions is so difficult to measure. I think she is very aware of that. So that there's a lot of uncertainty, and that's why we are very much interested in finding out. And we've been changing our equipment as well over time. So we think we have a better equipment in place, and then trying to test what might be the biggest uncertainty that we see.
All right. And then last question of the day, does yard grass with lead have impacts for children other than eating food grown in soil with lead?
Yeah, so the biggest impact that you would see is actually the kids eating the soil, either consciously or unconsciously. There are kids with pica behaviors that would really eat the soil, that would really want to eat the soil. And that is the biggest worry if the kids are like that. But I think it can also be airborne too. If you're running around in those highly contaminated areas, then you can breathe in the lead particles. And so those are, I think, very important to think about. It's not just about eating the food that's grown in those contaminated soils.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for all of your time. I know that you mentioned the podcast. If you want to give us the name and the website of that, and then any other way that people can keep in contact with you or your work, if they want to learn more, how can they do that?
Yeah, so if you can go to climatetalks.emory.com, sorry, climatetalks.emory.edu, then they will be able to find all the information that I mentioned. The podcast is there, and then the webinar is there. And so I hope some of you would join us and listen to the episodes. Some of the COP26 episodes are really good. And so, yeah, I hope you would enjoy.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I think that wraps us up here today. As a reminder, this was recorded, and we'll have that recording on our website in the next couple of days. So you can check back in with that. And Eri, thank you so much for all of your time.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for the great questions as well.